Government. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm Director of the work of the Institute for Government on better policy making, which is actually what gives us our lead into tonight's event. It might be slightly odd. Normally we leave tax matters to our other IF colleagues in the Institute for Fiscal Studies, but tonight we thought we'd do a joint collaboration. Why that? When we did our research 2 years ago on better policy making, we didn't actually publish what people told us when we were interviewing civil servants were some of the examples of worst policy making in government. But I think it would be fair to say that tax got a disproportionate share of the mentions in the pantheon of dishonour as areas where policy was really made serially quite badly. So we've been very interested in this theme of could you apply some of the norms of better policy making to the exceptional case of the budget. And of course the Chancellor came into office in 2010 committed to make some very real improvements to the budgetary process. But we thought there was still more to do, and so we thought 1 month before what we hope will not be an omni-shambolic budget, it was a good opportunity to re-engage with, is there anything that can be done about the budget process and about the way we make tax policy in this country? So we've got a fantastically top panel. On my far left, no political significance at all in the seating order, we have Paul Johnson, who I think probably all of you will know is the director of the independent and highly respected, the words that every politician almost has to use, as though it's in their title, Institute for Fiscal Studies. Then we have Chris Wales. Chris leads PwC's work with governments of developed and developing countries on tax policy and administration, and of course has been an advisor in the Treasury and was the author of the chapter in the Merleys Review on the tax policy process. Then on my far right, again no symbolism at all, is Will Morris, who's Global Tax Policy Director at GE and Chair of the CBI Tax Committee. And finally, we have Vanessa Holder from the Financial Times. So what we're going to do tonight is Paul is going to do something that is absolutely unprecedented for someone from the IFS, which is to speak without slides. And Paul is already very nervous about this. Paul is going to speak without slides for about 15 minutes. And then we're going to have quick reflections from their different perspectives from Chris, Will and Vanessa. And then we very much want to get, we know this is a deeply expert room, and we may have made a great forecasting error, because I forecast massive fallout from tonight, which might have been wrong. So I assume most of the people who would accept it would actually still be trying to get budget work done, as we would have been doing when I worked on tax policy 20 years ago. But anyway, so apologies to people in the other room. Then we're going to have contributions, comments, questions, whatever. I know there's a huge amount of expertise here, all focused on the question of, is this really the best we can do in the way we make tax policy? So, Paul Johnson.
Well, thank you, Jill, and thank you for being the organising force behind this and making this, this happen. We at the IFS usually spend our time talking about tax policy, not the tax policy process, and hopefully all of you will have read the Slim Merleys volume, which will give you a good idea of what we think about tax policy. But one of the things that, that working on that for a period of time immediately leads you to think about is why is it the government hasn't adopted everything in Merleys? VAT at 20% on everything, for example. I can't understand it. The need for this, the need for thinking about why we end up where we are, as well as why where we are isn't the best place, I think is demonstrated time and again by various bits of tax policy. I could spend the whole of the next 20 minutes just talking about terrible bits of tax policy, but I'm going to try and restrain myself. But I did enjoy the article in today's Financial Times by John Kay about the 10p tax policy that Labour announced last week, which starts off, and I do feel for this. I first wrote this article 33 years ago, which is kind of how many of us at the IFS felt last Thursday, but on more occasions than that. So to try and address this kind of issue about what is there that we might do to make policy better so we end up with a better outcome? Well, I don't think the answer is that people are just unaware of the importance, or at least politicians and civil servants aren't unaware of the importance. But I think it is worth continuing to stress that everything that is spent, well, nowadays not everything that is spent, but hopefully in general everything that is spent is raised in tax. So if you add up education and health and social security and transport and the Home Office and everything else, that is equal on the other side of the scales to what you raise in tax. So in some sense, it ought to have a similar level of input in the policy, a similar level of debate publicly. You take 40% of national income in tax, it's going to matter. I'm going to talk about three aspects of the process, though, in terms of thinking about why we end up where we are. One is about tax strategy, not what it should be, but about strategy in principle. One is about challenge and scrutiny, and one is about debate. And I think the first of those is probably the most important, and that is a tax strategy. Now, as I said, in the Murley's review, we set out, and you've got the sort of short version of it outside, we set out a tax strategy. I'm sure that no one will believe that every bit of that is right, and many people will disagree with it altogether. But it is an example of what we think is a coherent strategy. Now, I don't think any government has ever really set out a strategy for tax. I mean, there may be people here who will disabuse me of that. There are strategies for particular bits of the tax system, and actually this government has been not too bad in putting out some strategies for particular bits of the tax system, better than some of its predecessors. But they're pretty limited. And when you compare tax policy making with any other bit of government, you've got strategies coming out of your ears. The number of strategies I've seen for skills and education and health and so on and so on and so on is probably too many. But as I say, the number of strategies I've seen for tax as a whole is zero. So does that matter? Well, I think it matters in several respects. I think it matters because I think you could make a reasonable argument that that's where some of the sort of more egregious mistakes come from. If you had a serious strategy, would you really have introduced a 0% rate of corporation tax and then got rid of it a year or two later, introduced a 10p tax rate and then got rid of it a decade or so later, introduced changes to capital gains tax, which you got rid of a few years later? Now, strategies don't mean that you don't make mistakes, but they may make some of the worst ones less obvious or less possible. But I think it's not just about the policies. I think if you look at the last budget, which I will always love because it has, if not introduced, popularised the word omni-shambles, which I think it probably means in some sense is remembered longer than most other budgets. It has a bigger effect on the English language at least. In a sense, I think we took... I didn't take the message from that all the policy in it was bad. I think quite a lot of the tax policy in it was perfectly good tax policy. The point is that it wasn't part of anything that was recognised as a strategy and therefore was hard to accept. So take the VAT, take pensioner allowances, the abolition of the higher pensioner allowance. I think if the Chancellor had said back in 2010, my strategy is to raise the personal allowance to £10,000, and obviously as part of that strategy it then makes no sense to have a pensioner allowance which is a few £100s more, that seems to me an entirely sensible way to go. The other big, I mean there are lots of things in there, the other big one of course was VAT on pasties and other warm food. Now if the Chancellor's view is that bit by bit, pasty by pasty if you like, the VAT system should be, the borderline from where it's 20% to where it's 0 should gradually creep along so that we get more and more into 20, that seems to be entirely sensible. But that of course is not what he said or where he was. Well, maybe it was where he was, but it's certainly not what he said. The VAT system is one example of many parts of the system which doesn't work. We have to have a essentially arbitrary point at which you have the 20p and the 0 on the other side. Moving that point is not bad policy, but if it were part of a strategy, then it may have looked a bit better. More generally, I think a lack of a sense of direction, a clear strategy, creates uncertainty, it creates complexity, it creates opportunities for avoidance and evasion, it potentially creates increased compliance costs and higher welfare costs. I think the lack of clear direction is probably one of the biggest issues here. And I just add here, I'm not saying that there isn't a strategy on individual bits of the system, and when it comes to things like consultation, I'm not saying in any sense that there isn't much consultation on tax. The real issue is that there's no overarching strategy. The consultation, for example, just as a lot of the tax policy, is not about the overall system or the direction or the principles. It's about very specific elements of the system. And I think if we had a strategy, a clear sense of direction, then there could be debate and consultation about the overall direction. So strategy is my first kind of plea, I suppose. Second thing is really about challenge and scrutiny of tax policy. Now, I'm absolutely not suggesting that there isn't much challenge or debate or consultation about specific parts of tax policy, but there do seem to be areas where there is less challenge and scrutiny here than there is in many other parts of public policy. So, for example, parliamentary oversight. Going back to what I was saying before, if 40% of national income is spent on welfare and education and health and so on, and you have a select committee for each one of those, well, we don't even have a select committee dedicated just to tax. We have the Treasury Select Committee, which focuses to some extent on tax. So we have less focus on tax in the structure of the parliamentary oversight than we have on individual bits of spending. And whilst there's been a welcome increase in the role of the Lords, as there's been a welcome change to the point at which legislation is put into the public domain, there is still a lesser role for the Lords in this area than in many others. So I think it's also worth saying, actually, that my sense, at least, and I haven't looked at this properly, is that the Treasury Select Committee and the Public Accounts Committee are doing more on tax than they have in the past. But it remains the case that there's a relative lack of resource. Say tax is not the only thing the Treasury Select Committee does. I think there's a lack of systematic evaluation on the effect of tax changes. There's some evaluation, and again, I think this is improving, but relative to the amount of review of the effect of policies elsewhere, I think there's rather less of it. If we reviewed the effect of all the policies, or many of the policies, or the key policies that are put in, publicly and independently after they've happened, that would certainly be helpful. The other part, I think, of challenge and scrutiny is about that which occurs or doesn't occur within the executive, within government. Now, this is an old point, but I think it's a good one, which is I think the Treasury is actually extremely good at challenging other departments. I think it plays an unbelievably valuable role. But when the Treasury is making policy and there's no one to challenge it, who challenges the challenger, as it were, that reduces the amount of checks and balances that exist in the system, and that applies particularly to tax. Now, of course, there is another department involved in tax policy, the HMRC. Now, I don't want to make any kind of judgment about the effectiveness of the partnership between HMRC and Treasury. I don't know at the moment how well the partnership is working. I think I've seen some evidence that it's getting better over time. But I would just want to draw out three themes that I think are common in what people have written about this, but certainly common in what people that I speak to, tax practitioners particularly, have told me. One is that there is just a lack of clarity in the tax sort of stakeholder community about the relative roles of the two partners in the tax policy making process, and that creates a degree of lack of certainty about how to engage. Second is that there is a perception that most of the power over policy resides in Treasury rather than in HMRC, but that there is a limited amount of expertise in Treasury. and then the third is there is a limited amount of, as I was saying earlier, review of policy. So I'd be very interested. There are people here who experience this firsthand, and indeed who are key parts of the HMRC HMT engagement. But it seems to me that there is at least space for more clarity about exactly how that's working. It is, as I say, not something I observe firsthand, but which many people I speak to do and worry about. The final point I want to make, really, and here it's very hard to make any policy recommendations, is one just about the quality of the debate about tax. The debate is focused very much on totemic issues, income tax rates, for example. That's why we have the 10p tax rate keep coming back time and time again. It's why income tax rates, the main income tax rates, have not risen since 1975, whilst pretty much every other tax rate has increased over that period. Most particularly national insurance contribution rates, of course, have gone up and up and up over that period. So one tax rate on income has come down and another tax rate on income has gone up for purely presentational reasons, because people are ill-informed about how these things work. And I don't think there's any other reason that you can give for that. That is purely a symptom of a poor debate about tax, but also a symptom of governments taking advantage of that poor debate. The debate is also incredibly simplistic and sometimes wrong, and I think gets us into dangerous territory. I've spoken about tax policy and income distribution issues to numerous audiences, and I'm increasingly being asked at the end of that, why don't the rich pay any tax? Now, my response to which can only be, well, if they didn't pay any tax, we really would be in trouble, because the rich, no doubt there are some, maybe many among them, who pay less than we would like and who put a lot of effort into paying less than they would if they didn't put effort into it. But we know that the top 1% of income taxpayers pay a quarter of all income tax. The idea that the rich don't pay tax is not only wrong, I genuinely think it is dangerous to the sustainability of the tax system, because the more that people believe it, the more that people will themselves feel they can get away with not paying tax. So the quality of this debate, and I say I don't know how to sort that out. We have a journalist who maybe will tell us later. I think it's absolutely crucial, and we at the IFS do our best, but it's clearly not good enough. And I do hope I don't have to in 33 years' time. So I first wrote this article 33 years ago, but I wouldn't be surprised. So just to conclude, what do I think we need? We need governments and oppositions, preferably, really to set out more in the way of a long-term strategy. That itself will help scrutiny, but I think we need more scrutiny from Parliament and more resource from it. I think we need to review the effectiveness independently and consistently of tax policy. I think we need, my sense is that we need more clarity about the relative roles and the way that HMT and HMRC work together. I think we need an autumn statement which is really consulting, which it increasingly is, to be fair. I think we need bigger barriers to silly changes in the system. We need more and much better informed debate. I'm hoping that my fellow speakers will actually answer the question and say how we might achieve any of that. Thank you.
So silly is, of course, a very technical term in IFS speak. Chris, any of this realistic? Any of this resonate with you?
The trouble is that I agree with most of what Paul said, and so I see some danger that we mostly agree about issues tonight. So maybe it's important to kind of broaden it out and think about some points on the edges of what Paul said. I'd like to start off, though, and I've only got a few minutes to speak. I'd like to start off really by trying to give this kind of frame of reference, because although I don't tend to work terribly well within the structures and frameworks, I think it's actually quite important to have a way of thinking about the tax policy making process. So who are the actors in the tax policy making process and what are their roles, how do they interact? And for me, there are kind of 4 fundamental groups of people who potentially play a part in the tax policy making process. First of all, there's and perhaps most obviously, the internal institutions of government, the people who actually appear to make tax policy within the framework of government. HMRC and the Treasury and their relationships fall squarely within that. Do other government departments contribute or not? Well, that's an interesting question, and as you approach budget time, we probably know the answer to that question, I suspect. It's not like that in every country in the world, and we can talk a little bit more about practice in other countries, because I think there are lessons to be learnt. Anyway, first of all, internal institutions of government. Secondly, what I think of as being the external institutions, the people who, the organisations who interact with policymakers, the people who are proactively thinking about policy. And here I'm thinking of at least a group of academics who are interested in tax policy. You know, the occasional institute or think tank or whatever, like, you know, maybe the IFS or the Oxford University Centre for Business Taxation, and possibly 1 or 2 others, but maybe not that many, who actively engage with the policy process. The third category is, of course, Parliament. Parliament has a bit of a role in tax policy making, although sometimes if you listen to some committee chairs, you'd think that tax legislation had somehow arrived out of the blue and that none of them were responsible for it. But that's a separate issue. Parliament clearly has at least 2 potential roles to play in the policy making process. One is obviously scrutiny and arguably challenge, although I suppose you can't really separate those two too much. And the second is whether they can give any sensible inputs to the process of actually making policy in the first place. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The third group of people is really all of the rest of us. We're the 4th group of actors in the policy-making process. How does government engage with us? Well, the easiest bit for government is to engage with the business community, which it does, and probably does much better than it did 20 years ago, when probably the Treasury view was that it was dangerous to go and talk to people in business. They might be occasionally permitted to come in and talk to you, but you certainly wouldn't go and ask them what they thought. Civil society, who increasingly have something to say about tax policy, and usually say quite loudly and quite publicly, and in some cases quite embarrassingly for a whole bunch of people on all sides. Aided and abetted, of course, by the media. And the media have increasingly decided to write about tax policy and therefore inevitably have some kind of influence on it. And of course they have an influence on the rest of us who may have some views on tax policy but probably don't understand it perfectly and may therefore not be able to engage fully. And the media has a role in educating us about tax policy and helping us to understand what's going on and why it's going on. So that's my framework, four main categories of people. I actually think it's quite useful to think of it in those terms because tax policy doesn't just arrive out of the blue. It comes through a process. It starts off with an idea, and how that idea is developed and shaped is quite important. And at the end of the process, you have an outcome which Parliament nods through, and off you go. HMRC goes and implements it. It is pretty much the same in all countries, but there are interesting variations, and I'd say we'll come back to that in a minute, possibly in questions. Parliament, let me just make a few specific comments about Parliament. I actually think Parliament's upped its game quite a lot in the last 2 or 3 years, and the committee chairs, Treasury Committee and even the House Lords of the Economic Affairs Committee have decided they ought to look at this in more detail. I think there's a fundamental problem in what they do actually, and I think the fundamental problem is the lack of resource. And I know I've said this to lots of audiences over a long period of time. Compared with some countries, the British Parliament is woefully supported. So if you bring in a bunch of people whom all of us have elected, they have no special skills in this area, no training. You expect them to look at legislation, scrutinise it, make contributions to development of policy, and frankly, you may as well pull in any bunch of people from the streets and ask them, because without some sensible professional support, and preferably not coming from the executive, who possibly have a slightly biased view of what should be happening, unless you have that support, then Parliament really can't exercise either its scrutiny role or or make an effective contribution to policy. So I think they're doing increasingly an interesting job. I'm kind of disappointed that some of the things that they've embarked on have resulted in reports which are slightly too shallow for my taste, and not necessarily a proper reflection of everything that's been provided as inputs to them. I think that's disappointing. I think, again, it's a question of resource primarily. I think it's quite welcome that the House of Lords is beginning to kind of creep up on a role on taxation, because I don't know whether I dare say this really, but the whole process of electing representatives and appointing people to the House of Lords, which I accept is a relatively big issue, maybe not for discussion tonight, maybe means that as far as democracy is concerned, the House of Lords isn't necessarily that unrepresentative. Anyway, let's move on quickly from that. Some other key points that would help with the whole process of making tax policy, and don't worry, I'm not going to go in detail through this. Access to data is clearly fundamental to anybody who sits outside the immediate circle of people in HMRC and Treasury who do have access to reasonable amounts of data. Although I can say, as a policymaker, when I wanted some information and I discovered it was going to take 9 months to get it because it was all on paper files, that was quite dispiriting. So even within government, access to data can not always be perfect. Outside government, it's hopeless, and there needs to be much more stuff published than there is. There needs to be more information made available for academic research. There have been some big steps in that direction in the last few years, which I think is very welcome. But you will enormously increase the quality of debate if you let people have information. Now, government has to decide whether it wants that to happen or not. Personally, I think it should happen. I think you'll get better policy as a result. It's the same with other information that either reflects or feeds into the tax policy making process. I'm just going to have a 30-second rant about the OBR. I think it's outrageous that the OBR doesn't publish its forecasts a week before the main budget event. I see no excuse whatsoever for the secrecy that surrounds OBR forecasts. They're public information, and they should be made available to everybody at the same time. There's lots of important stuff there that influences how you think about policy and how you think about measures which are being proposed. If you have that information published at a time when people can look at it and can engage properly in the budget debate, then maybe you'll have a more mature debate. If you sit in, and everybody does this who's involved in the process, if you sit in the shadow cabinet room on budget day and you get 4 pages of the OBR's report, most of it's already redacted, and that's all you get before the Chancellor stands up. I mean, that doesn't allow the proper democratic process to take place in the House of Commons. Anyway, runs over, okay? Personally, I think the OBR ought to be a creature of Parliament. I think that would serve everybody's interests in the budget process much better. And so separating it from the Treasury, giving it to Parliament, will allow proper scrutiny. It will allow policy measures to be costed at the will of committees in a similar way in which it happens in the US. I think that would be enormously helpful. So I'm probably going to stop at that point, although I've got lots of other points I want to make. There are other countries in which tax policy is made better than it is here. There are countries where it's made very much worse. So you have to be grateful, if you will, and or perhaps a representative of a smaller company. You'll find some countries where they really don't think you should have a role in developing policy at all or giving input to it. Over the last 15 years or so, we've come a long way in that regard.
So, Chris, a quick trailer. Who are your top stars of making tax policy well? What are your top 2 or 3 countries?
My top 3 countries, in reverse order, would be Sweden, New Zealand and Finland. I think Finland does it best. The Swedes say that's because they copied theirs. The people in New Zealand have a very good policy process, but the execution of it is slightly flawed. we can come back to this in a minute.
Okay, so you can all think about whether you agree with that, that top listing and why. Will, the perspective from business, and you sort of engaged Treasury and HMRC, is it better than it was? Could it be improved? Would Paul's suggestions make any difference?
Yes.
We can move on.
let me speak a little longer than that. And I should also say that my perspective on this, I also work for a government, but I work for the US government and the US Treasury. And the policy structure there is actually what was meant to motivate O'Donnell, and perhaps didn't get carried over in quite the way that it has done in the US. And I think some of the problems come from that. So I'll talk about that as well. I mean, in terms of strategy, I agree that there should be a strategy, but you know, in the end, if we're talking about tax, we're talking about money. And when it comes to dealing with money, it's very hard to put a structure around that which will last for anything longer than, you know, the next 3 weeks, basically. So we can, again, come out with great strategies, but if the need for money arises somewhere, or indeed if some other political issue arises relating to that, it's going to change. So in a sense, we set ourselves up for failure, I think, if we try and design an overarching strategy. That said, as Paul did also acknowledge, in certain areas of the tax system, this government in particular, but also the last government, did have strategies for dealing, you know, again in the area that interests me, with corporate tax. So the corporate tax roadmap, for example, which has dominated pretty much the first 2.5 years of this government, I think has actually been relatively successful. I think it set out, it articulated a policy, and it's followed through on that policy. I think other groups can help with that as well. I mean, again, without sort of blowing the CBI's trumpet too much. 5 years ago, we came out with a task force report which set out a relatively comprehensive business tax strategy, many elements of which have actually come to pass, and we're now going to repeat the process again, to try and inform the system. So I think it's important to do that. Having done that, I'm now going to get quite granular, and I'm going to talk about process, because I do actually think that the process is quite important, particularly if, as I say, it's difficult to actually have a complete strategy, because the strategy itself stands no chance of lasting unchanged for any period of time. The process, however, may you know, sort of constrain in a helpful way the changes which take place. Let me first say what I think has actually worked over the past 2.5 years. There was, as many of you will know, if I hold it up, nobody will see what it is, and it's the wrong colour anyway. But this was a document which the Treasury put out in June of 2010, Tax Policy Making, a New Approach. And I think it's fundamentally changed, and fundamentally changed for the better, the front end of the process. Many of you will recall that the way tax policy quite often used to get made was a sort of fire, ready, aim approach. First you'd come out with the law, and then subsequently you'd work out the policy articulation. And it's sometimes hard to sort of get things right if that's the order in which you take it. Whereas if you do have to articulate what the policy is first, then there is a chance that it's going to be a little more coherent, and also that you'll follow through on it rather than just making it up as you go along. So I think that's worked well. I think the articulation of policy in the statements that get put out around the, I mean, you know, the sort of the tax statements that get put out around the autumn statement also work quite well. I think there is a little less budget secrecy. I wouldn't want to overemphasize that, but certainly, you know, putting out draft legislation well in advance, allowing comment on that, again, is something which works. And, you know, it tends to generate a bit of heat when you see something which is less than perfectly drafted. But on the other hand, if you've asked for that and you have a meaningful chance to input on it, then I think, again, that's a great thing. And then finally, Paul mentioned consultation, and consultation itself is not going to produce good tax policy. But as I've said, I mean, I agree with him, consultation shouldn't do that. But if, again, you have a policy process at the front end which works so that there is this policy articulation, and therefore what the consultation is about policy which has been set out and therefore can be commented on, consultation, again, can make that better. Okay, so, you know, I think that part works. However, I think that the this will come as no surprise to some people in the room who've heard this before, I think the middle and the end part of the process don't necessarily work quite as well. And I think there are a couple of issues, and I am going to talk about what I think may be going on inside of HMT and HMRC on this one. I agree, I think, with what Chris said. There are simply not enough people in the policy function in Treasury to make it work. In the US, the policy function is, I mean, given that the US is a huge country and given that the IRS is a huge organization, the policy function is still relatively small, but it's dedicated. So there are about 30 or 35 people who cover domestic and international. But, you know, we were taken from the private sector with 7 or 8 years of tax experience. We were full-time civil servants, so there wasn't, you know, the secondment issue. And our job was to interact with the IRS and to make sure that we called on their experience, but we were the policy leads. And that worked. And it worked in part because that was the way the structure was set up and we had the support of the right people. But we did also have, you know, there was the expertise, the policy expertise in Treasury to make that work. That is not the case in HMT. And part of the problem, moving on to the second issue, is that there's no clear career structure. There is nothing which says policy is the way to get to wherever it is that you want to get to in the Treasury, but particularly in the Treasury, but also in HMRC, and I'll come to that in a second. And I think that there needs to be that career structure. Now, you may say, well, you know, if you've only got a department of 6 people, how do you create a career structure around that? Well, the answer is 6 people is not enough. But you do also need to, it's more than that, obviously, but I mean, it's a relatively small number. And to do a career structure around that is difficult. Nevertheless, if what you're doing is either pulling people out of HMRC who have to go back to HMRC, or you have secondees, which is currently not the favoured route, thanks to some political intervention, or you have, you know, the talented generalists who are simply passing through for 18 months and take most of those 18 months to actually, you know, figure out which way up the yellow book is, then, you know, that's not going to work. So you need to find a different way to do it. And I think you can do. The next problem, which relates to that, and again is an outgrowth of O'Donnell, not properly implementing the system, you know, the sort of what it was looking at, was the downgrading of the policy function in HMRC. If you look back to pre-O'Donnell and you look at something like international, for example, there was a real policy function in there. And furthermore, you know, that was a good thing for your CV to have done if you wanted to succeed in HMRC. So we've, you know, that was broken apart. You know, sort of the McKinsey boxes went all over the place. The people went all over the place. Some of them went outside the boxes and left and went to work for somebody else. And that structure broke down. And that, I think, was that was probably, of all of the mistakes that got made, that was the worst one. And what that means is, so you have a slightly underpowered policy function in Treasury. You don't have a career stream in HMRC which any longer values this. But you do nevertheless have the expertise in HMRC which is being called on. And what that means is that HMRC says, well, okay, you know, we're involved in policy maintenance, not an entirely helpful phrase. We're involved in policy maintenance, which means we're going to bring a policy maintenance point of view to you know, whatever input we have into the legislation. So in fact, you have less policy input from either side into the legislation as it goes forward. I think there are solutions to these problems. I mean, I'm very much hoping that the second commissioner, second permanent secretary I see sitting directly in front of me, you know, may be able to do something about this. But I think we need to recreate inside of HMRC a respect, an institutional respect for the policy function, and to rebalance the relationship with Treasury, given that probably what I've said about the Treasury function isn't going to happen. I want to mention one other thing, which Sam will, of course, appreciate, which is that the drafting process is still not perfect. So we have a much better policy articulation, and some of the documents that came out, for example, on the controlled foreign company rules, the policy articulation was crystal clear. It was really, whether you agreed with it or didn't agree with it, it was clear where the government was going, it was clear where the rules were going to go, and then sort of, 800 pages of legislation, which are difficult to work your way through, let me put it like that. Sprinkled with anti-abuse rules all over the place. It is very hard. I mean, we worked quite hard to put some statement into the guidance at least, which would refer you back to the policy articulation. But you can look at the legislation for as long as you like, and you are going to find it very hard to pin things back. And there's a question as to why that happens. This is probably, there's not long enough to discuss this, and again, it's something that we're trying to work on. But how is it that maybe there aren't enough people inside HMRC working on it? Everybody's too strained. There's the, to my view, ridiculous constraint of the finance bill every year. So you get to this time, you get to this point where sometime in March people say, well, we can't change anything anymore. And you go, don't you want to try and get it right? No, but you don't understand. That we've got to get it into the finance bill. And then there's what does or doesn't go on between HMRC and Parliamentary Council and all the rest of that. So I think the front end of the process is working very well. I think there are real improvements which could still be made to the back end of the process. And then one final comment about Parliament. I agree with Chris. I mean, again, in the US, which I would note he did not, surprisingly, have in his top 3 list of tax policy nirvanas, the Congress does nevertheless have a lot of independent help, and that does allow the Congress to, whether it does it well or not, but it does allow it to scrutinize legislation. So the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives has a professional staff, which is essentially a political staff. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have the staff. Same in the Senate Finance Committee. And there is then also a non-partisan group, the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is available to help draft legislation and to do the budget scoring and analysis. And that does allow the Congress to participate meaningfully. You may not always like it, but meaningfully in the tax policy process. And I think that that's helpful. And one final thing which I think would help is that I think the discipline of legislative history, essentially of having a document which moves forward as the legislative stages are completed, is actually very helpful. And we have nothing like that.
Okay, it's really interesting. I'm going to give a final word to Vanessa before we throw it over to questions. Vanessa.
Well, speaking as a journalist, and so journalists' interests don't align particularly with good policy making. We love things like the resurrection of the 10p rate. And one of the grimmest things that I can remember was hearing Philip Hammond in the run-up to the last election. He said, we're going to do all this stuff about policy making and, flagging things up in advance and so forth. He said, we're going to make tax so boring that no one is even going to want to know the date of the budget. So I was full of, trembled at the prospect, because journalists love the budget. We love the drama. You get lots of space. You actually get lots of time to write articles. You've got the fun of looking from the small print for the thing that they've tried to slide past you. And then the next day we all troop off to hear Paul and his colleagues give their assessment. And it's a great set-piece event. And even though I can see that the timetable probably does cause quite a few problems, and the need to pull a rabbit out of the hat, you probably do get more daft things, and some of the complexity can probably be blamed on it. But I do think having the annual budget is a great thing. It is one period when you do get a lot of debate and a lot of focus on tax issues. So wouldn't want to see that one go. And clearly I needn't have worried about the politicians trying to make tax boring, or rather more boring, because it's just kept on coming. And we've had some great stories, and particularly liked the shares for employment rights one, which Paul and the OBR were pretty critical of. It's almost as though politicians just cannot resist the temptation to put things in, maybe in the hope of influencing people for behaviour for the better, or maybe just to court popularity, and then express outrage when people use it to purposes to which they were not put. And I also enjoyed the Public Accounts Committee this week, its report on marketed tax avoidance schemes, when particularly on the film schemes, you know, that was another example of politicians doing something for purpose, you know, very, very good motives, but then being surprised when they were used for quite different reasons. And there's so many other examples, all the sort of entrepreneurial stuff, and going back decades, really. The attempt to get people to invest in small businesses and trying to get entrepreneurs to do things. And then when you talk to researchers who actually do work on, you know, what motivates people to start businesses, a lot of these things in the tax code, you know, they don't have any impact at all. People are just not very aware of them at that stage. But I don't suppose this is going to change, because it's kind of what would be the point of going into politics if you weren't going to try and make things happen. And so we do end up with clearly some pretty daft policy, as you know, Paul and Chris and to some extent Will said. And we also end up with policy which doesn't get as scrutinised as well as it should do. And it's improving. I do think the government's brought in some things which make a difference. The OBR is good. Publishing the legislation in December gives people a chance to really go through it. And there is a lot of consultation. And I think there's clearly more interest in tax than there used to be. I remember about 5 years ago, an MP on the Finance Committee explaining what it was like to be on the Finance Committee. He started off by saying that the members were press ganged. You know, it was a really difficult job to get people actually to sit in the seats. And it was all seen as very pointless because it had to vote along party lines. And people were so uninterested that it was, you know, seen as the time to get your correspondence done. And somebody was keen on portable chairs. And so it all came out. I don't think you'd get that now. I think it's one of the good things of everyone thinking tax is very exciting. The MPs are really, a lot of MPs are very interested in tax, and that's good. But, you know, just to reinforce what we've already heard about the resources that the MPs can draw on. I mean, I sit through so many of these select committees, and it's so frustrating. You know, there's sometimes the questioning is just not as good as it would be if the MPs either had, you know, more time to devote themselves to the subject, or were just able to draw on proper research. I mean, it's very hard, I think, sometimes to be parachuted into a job. And yes, you've got somebody in front of you, but if you don't really know where the issues that you should be asking questions on are, you often don't get the reports which are as good as they should be. And I just want to say one thing, which is just slightly worrying me about the sort of checks and balances. And I think the UK is probably quite far out, a bit of an outlier in terms of how little we have in checks and balances. And Chris mentioned how much of a movement there's been over the last 20 years or so on corporate tax and the willingness to consult with business. And in so many ways, that's got to be a good thing. I mean, it is crazy if you're trying to make your tax system into an asset, not a liability, not to actually ask the people you're trying to tailor it for. However, I worry that we've got a problem on legitimacy as a result of the process being one which not very many people are involved. And there's not a lot of debate around some of the points. I mean, there have been huge documents, roadmaps, and an awful lot in this endless process of trying to get where we've got to on corporate reforms. But I think now a time when there is probably unprecedented interest in corporate tax, it's actually proving I think people find it quite hard to understand. Some of the messages also the government's been putting out recently have been quite mixed. I'm almost left with an impression that this area of tax policy is just too difficult to explain. And that's quite a worry if things continue as they are with this very heightened interest.
Too difficult to explain to the public or too difficult to explain to ministers?
It may be both. I'd never thought about this too difficult to to explain to ministers. But that could be part of the problem. And that is, I'm trying to sort of pass the buck here a bit, because Chris and Paul said that the quality of the debate that we have in this country is very poor on tax, and it's the media's problem. So I'm trying to say the quality of the debate is very poor in the country, and it's a politician's problem.
Okay, excellent. We've had 4 quite lively contributions. So we've got Paul with his mission to make budgets boring, which may have to wait for the Philip Hammond Chancellorship, which probably a few years away yet. George Osborne probably not too worried about that one. But we're going to take some comments, questions from the audience. Can I just warn the civil servants in the room that this is on the record? So think about that. You know how you always comment on what you really think about policy by doing it as one of those, lines to take on difficult questions. So if you just think about that before you do it, because it's very difficult to delete things, and there may be journalists in the audience. There's certainly journalists on the panel. So let's go and let's get some questions from around the audience. We'll get it going, and then we'll pick up some of the other panelists' points. So we have, let's go here, and then along there, and then forward. Yeah.
Hi. My reading
Can you tell us who you are?
My name is Graham Hunter from the Open University. My reading of the Middle East report tends to suggest to me that part of the problem with budgets is that there is a tendency to try to influence behaviour or make certain allowances, and this confuses the question of raising the appropriate amount of money. So we think it's a good idea that people should eat fresh food, so we then have to decide what fresh food is, and everybody has an argument about that, and that's where the pasty tax comes in. We think it's a good idea that people smoke less, so we decide we're going to put a tax on it. Is that the best way to encourage people to smoke less? So I think there's a confusion in the budgeting process because we're trying to do too much. We're not simply trying to raise money, we're trying to influence behaviour, and we're trying to make people do things.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Let's go along to, if you can pass the mic, pass it along the row. Yeah, tell us who you are.
Dan Corrie, and I have some involvement in setting tax policy in the Treasury and Downing Street in the later Blair and Brown years. But one thing that strikes me about all this is, what is good tax policy? And there's kind of an assumption, it's come out in the conversation, that we all sort of agree what it is, and sometimes the IFS believe it's sort of getting those marginal curves all smoothed out and so forth, and the businesses all know exactly what they think is good tax policy. But the public get missed out of this all the time, and I think in a sense that's where politicians, they're representing the public, and sometimes the public are a bit irrational, and sometimes politicians, just like in any other policy, should stand up to them. But sometimes the public are onto something. Sometimes we as economists exaggerate, in my view, the incentive effects of having beautiful, smooth curves. And the other thing I would say, which when you work in government, certainly you work in Treasury or Downing Street, you are lobbied like mad, particularly from the business sector. And you do feel that someone's going to be there for the general public. It doesn't mean politicians get it right, and I think a lot of things that have been said from the platform are absolutely right if we had some strategies and so forth and people could debate them a bit more. But I'm very struck, Chris, I think it was a conference that you organised in Oxford, which I spoke at, where there was a long debate, lots of tax experts said if only we had big policy debate about things. And somebody from Italy, I think it was, gave an example that for many years they had a big open consultation, lots of academic work in the mid-90s, and they set a new tax policy, and it was pretty hopeless. And then when Monti came in the crisis and sort of set a new tax policy in a few weeks, it was much better. So you've got to be a bit careful.
So were the public for or against a 10p tax rate, given the politicians channeled both?
I'm not a pollster, but
anyway.
I suspect there was a bit of polling done before that policy was announced, each time in the last 33 years, whatever John Kay said.
Anyway, let's come here. There are quite a lot of people in the innovation room, so if anyone in the innovation room wants to ask a question, if they could sidle into here. Innovation room is the room that doesn't have the speakers in it. But anyway, yes.
Yes, my name is Hugh Edwards, chartered accountant. The tax is different from every other aspect of government policy because everyone feels strongly about it, whether you're a voter or a politician. And but increasingly in recent years, tax seems to have become much more ideological in tone. I know a journalist who talks a lot to Conservative MPs, backbench MPs. And it's quite clear from what he said. They loathe inheritance tax. They loathe the 40% tax rate. They loathe capital gains tax. And many of them are currently almost obsessed with flat taxes. And they look forward, some of them look forward in 10, 20, 30 years' time to the abolition of these taxes. And after we've got flat taxes, we might then live in the Valhalla of zero-rate income tax and fulfill Mr. Gladstone's promise of abolishing income tax, which even he failed to do. Does the panel think this is fantasy, or does it have legs, as they say?
Okay, and just come forward here, and then we'll go in the corner, and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes.
Clive Bates. How important is tax simplification? Is better tax policy inherently linked to simplification? And should we have things like a better regulation executive for taxation, or a one-in, one-out rule, or some of the things that have been done on, like a red tape review? Some of the things that have been done on regulation applied to the existing stock of taxation ideas.
Anyway, and let's go into the corner. So.
Adam Ridley, erstwhile special advisor to Geoffrey Howe and preparer of a little bit of tax policy in the 70s. When I listen to this debate, there are 3 or 4 gaps that I'd be interested to know why we see or hear so many gaps. One is the fundamental issues, the principles which are being driven by. In the good old days, we had a very important principle of fiscal neutrality. Haven't heard the word for a million years. Another very interesting question was that we used to talk about the consumption tax and its analogues. Now, I know this is still lurking in the undergrowth, and there's good literature about it in the States, and Professor Murley's and his team are resurrecting some of these issues. But I'm very, very surprised that the rest of the world never even hints at or talks in these terms. It's an enormous gap. Another quite different thing, we used to think a great deal about how you simplified and made the system clear, comprehensible, and operational, just going back to the previous speaker. Ministers quickly concluded you couldn't simplify fast, so you had to abolish at least a tax a year. That went by the wayside when the late lamented Chancellor Kenneth Clarke started doing it in the other direction. Finally, on process, procedure, consultation, and all the rest of it, there was a great deal that was said and thought in the 70s and even in the 80s. There were things like rewriting the tax code. There were things like the tax rewriting in better English. We had all sorts of other ideas about having a much slower and stabler system. Now, of course, this is still talked about, but I think there's an awful lot in the past that might deserve resurrecting and reconsidering.
So, Paul, basically, have you got a sort of hidden agenda around sort of fiscal neutrality, a clear view of what good tax policy is? And do we make too many demands on the tax system by making it into a sort of instrument of other policy objectives as well as just there for raising revenue? I have very strong views on that, I have to say. So anyway, when I worked on tax issues...
I don't think the IFS's agenda on fiscal neutrality is at all well hidden. It sort of runs throughout the Murley's review and many things that we say. And I think it actually is sort of part of the answer to several of the questions about simplification, about the tendency to influence behaviour and so on. What do we mean by lack of neutrality? It means when you're taxing similar things differently. And what does that create? Well, that creates an immense amount of complexity. It creates unfairness, and it creates an awful lot of additional rules around what you put in place in order to stop the avoidance, which inevitably arises. And there are huge numbers of examples of where there is unnecessary non-neutrality in the system. So I think that is an absolutely crucial sort of part of the whole story. And I think if you're thinking about simplification, that's what I think of as being simplification. It is taking away those, or some of those kind of places where there are unnecessary differential treatment between different, if you consume a cake or a biscuit, or if you raise your money as a company through tax or through equity or debt, if you you do a whole series of different things in terms of how you take your income, whether it's got national insurance contributions associated with you're self-employed, whether you're a small company or whether you're employed. I mean, all of these are, these are the big non-neutralities, and then there are large numbers of smaller ones. And I think, was it Vanessa who mentioned the film tax relief and so on. I mean, all of these are kind of, you create problems of their own. Now, there clearly are places where the tax system is important for influencing behaviour, and smoking is unquestionably likely to be one of those, but the tax system does try to do far too much in supporting entrepreneurs. I mean, that is where a lot of the lack of simplicity comes from. So I completely agree with that. I think the one other kind of question that I'd like to just kind of respond to is this kind of this question of what is good tax policy. And I mean, and Dan Corrie's kind of almost defence of politicians saying they're on the side of the public. Well, I don't really buy that. I mean, the kind of
technically you.
I mean, do we really believe that national insurance contributions have gone up and up, and income tax rates have come down and down because that's the politicians really wanting to give the public what's the right thing? I mean, I don't buy that at all. I think that's just fooling people, and I think that's a different issue altogether.
So, Will, I was just wondering on this, on Clive's point here, I mean, the equivalent of the Better Regulation Executive for Tax should be the Office for Tax Simplification. I mean, has that had a sort of notable effect on holding back the sort of forces of complication and made a big difference to maybe your smaller businesses rather than sort of big
no,
beasts
although
of the CBI?
cue John Whiting coming in through the door.
Sorry, go on.
I mean,
it's always the problem with the other rooms, you don't know who's there.
I mean, I think there are two answers to that. The first is that the first and sort of fundamental problem is that they don't get to look at new legislation. So, if you have 800 pages of stuff coming out, you can be doing good stuff, behind the scenes, but you're just, the complexity you're adding to the system is enormous. So I think it should be extended to new legislation, to be absolutely clear. And the second is that they're grotesquely understaffed. So, a couple of people part-time effectively, or again on secondment, means that you can't look at a great number of things. And then I suppose if there's a third problem, it's that sort of the political direction is look at all these beastly allowances and get rid of a sufficient number to drop us below 1,000. And again, is that the most useful way of dealing with it? No. So I mean, I think the OTS is a great idea. It just needs more people and a slightly different remit.
Vanessa, do you think tax debate's getting more ideological? Are we being
It's
looked
an
at it?
interesting point. I mean, you certainly feel the difference in the intake in this Parliament perhaps to the one for last, particularly on the Conservative MPs. But I don't honestly know. I think it's plausible, certainly.
Chris, I just wondered, you've held out the Finns as the people we should be looking at, and I just wondered if you could just very briefly, for those of us that don't know the intricacies of budget making in Finland, perhaps give us the top headlines of what they do better than us.
Okay, well, I'm surprised. I thought everybody
It may just be, everybody's come through the IFS list, I'm sure doesn't know this.
Okay,
Anyway.
I'm just going to do a plug at this point. If anybody wants to find out how other countries do their tax policy making, or at least how 9 other countries do their tax policy making, if you go to the Oxford University Centre for Business Taxation website, you will find a report which we presented and which Dan referred to a little while ago, which looks at policy making in a number of countries and looks at it using the frame of reference that I've mentioned. And it looks kind of like this, and this doesn't, I don't get paid anything for that, so if you just click on the website, you should find that. And it's quite a chunky read, but what do the Finns do well? The Finns do a number of things well. I guess one of the things that I liked about what the Finns at least have decided to do is that they decided to do post-implementation review. And I have a bit of a thing about post-implementation review, because unless you find out what happened when you changed the law, or at least changed it in a significant way, then you don't get any of the feedback into the policy-making process that you really need. And so, when somebody else comes along with a bright idea, instead of somebody being able to say, well, actually we tried that and it didn't work, or it had, it changed the behaviour of 4 people in Hartlepool. instead of having that, you just blunder into the same mistakes all over again. So the Finns had decided that one of the roles of Parliament was to make sure that all significant tax legislation had a clause in that said in 5 years' time or 3 years' time or whatever was appropriate to the particular piece of legislation. Before you carry on with this, you should come back and present a report that says what happened. Now, to some extent, this is required in the US, and the problem with there are all sorts of problems with the US. Sorry, but one of the problems in the US is that you get hundreds of these things, and they end up just being kind of nodded through. The sunset clauses are ultimately ineffective because of the dominance of the political process. And as we sit here talking about process, I mean, you have to remember that ultimately all of this is driven by politics rather than economics. Economics is definitely sitting behind the driver. And that's one of the problems. It's also what you get with a democracy, that Paul doesn't make tax policy, doesn't decide tax policy. George Osborne does, and that's obviously much better, isn't it? So I think, that what else do the Finns do well? The Finns are very good at consultation. There's no doubt about that. They're very open about tax policy at election time. Now, most of us know that at election time, the last thing you talk about is what you're going to do with the tax system, unless you're going to cut this and reduce that and give an extra relief for the other. You otherwise keep completely quiet. Now, in Finland, actually, they don't do that. In Finland, they tell you what they're going to do in a remarkably transparent way, which allows the voters to vote based on what you're actually going to do. And of course, you always get a coalition in Finland. So after the election, people go away and they produce a document which sets out what the coalition will do. And as part of that document, they actually go through measure by measure that they're committing to, and it's usually a pretty long list. And they cost out cost out all of those measures, so you know what revenue is going to be generated, or at least based on their estimations. So you actually have a pretty good understanding of what the coalition is going to do. Now, if you look at the coalition agreement for this government, which obviously was relatively novel here, it's quite thin in the tax area and a little bit light on any financial or economic information related to the tax measures that are set out. And I'm not saying there aren't any tax measures, tax proposals set out there, but they're relatively few, and they're set out at a relatively high level for the most part.
So how do they cope with Will's events then, or suddenly discovering you've got a big revenue gap or something like that, or you banked on being able to raise fuel duty in real terms, and then you basically duck it every time it comes round or whatever?
Well, whatever the nature of your system, you're always going to have events that you need to deal with as and when they arise. And interestingly, in a similar way to the way in which some of the debate about large multinationals has emerged in the UK, they had a similar debate in Finland, and a big concern about the use of debt to strip out earnings and therefore to reduce the tax take from the corporate sector. And so they have had a proper investigation of the issue, and they've looked at other models internationally, and they've had, as far as I know, a pretty satisfactory discussion with the business community and others affected, and there's been a much wider discussion as well, and they're introducing a restriction on deductibility of interest. But so that's what they do in a kind of very Nordic way. They have a mature debate about things, which
Vanessa is clearly sort of desperately hoping we don't go for that.
Vanessa will not be going to Finland anytime soon.
Anyway, let's have some more questions and comments from the audience. John, let's go to John, because John's been relegated to the previous room. So.
Thank you, John Whiting, Office of Tax Simplification. It's probably opposite that I ended up in the innovation room, because the OTS is an innovation. I think there's a serious point there. It is small, and thank you to Will for speaking up for us. It's in the nature of an experiment, and we're learning various things about simplification. And one is that, believe it or not, simplification is difficult. It's risky. It's changing the law, and one of the things we've learned is as if we didn't know it all already, changing the law is a great source of complexity in itself. But the real challenge is, I guess, is simplification worth it? At the moment, we are in many ways just tinkering at the edges. And again, one of the things we've learned is that gets you so far, but should we be doing wholesale simplification, which gets perhaps the big bang, some of the things Merle's pointed to? And it would be interesting to hear the panel's views, because as I say, the OTS is an experiment, we're learning, it's there for the lifetime of this Parliament. Is it therefore something that the next Parliament, the next government should continue with? And if so, should it be big bang type? Should it be involved with legislation as it comes through, or as we are doing, just tinkering with the stock?
Okay, that's good. Let's go right to the back of the room, and then Kerry will come here next.
Hello,
yes.
Rory Meakin, Taxpayers Alliance. What extent do you think that some of the problems that you identified earlier on with legitimacy of some taxes and the levels people are paying arises from public misunderstanding of incidents of taxation and who really pays the bill? And I'm thinking in particular with employers' national insurance contributions and corporation tax.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes.
And GAD speaking personally. 2 points about civil servants. First of all, it used to be the case that policy was the thing to be in. You were it if you were in policy. Not anymore. Over the last couple of years, people have been desperate to find a project for delivery. It's going to look good on the CV. And you're finding that policy is no longer able to attract as many people. Secondly, too many people shift jobs too often in the civil service, and that is why you don't get people there long enough to understand, to have the collective memory. We tried that in our department. We have somebody who's been with us for 40 years. He can actually remember what happened in 1983. It didn't work. Let's not go there. We should bring some of that back.
Okay, yeah, let's come forward.
Thanks. Julian McRae from the Institute for Government. Two sort of questions, possibly an easy one, because there have been a lot of suggestions, but I was interested in what people think the one doable and achievable thing might be that would make the most difference in the foreseeable future. And then secondly...
The process, not to the tax system.
To the process of how we make tax, make budget better or whatever. But the second one is slightly more tricky, and it goes to the heart of... I used to work at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and occasionally in the pub after work we would discuss the concept of the fiscal neutrality now political party. And it has to be said that I think, as I've moved in my career closer to the world of Dan Corrie and things like that, that I think we significantly overestimated the popularity of this party, from very small to absolutely negligible. If you were the strategy director or political director of this said political party, what do you think you would be doing now to try and shift some of the public debate on tax to achieve better tax policy?
Okay, and you to come, yeah.
Edward Troop, former special advisor, former Treasury official, currently an employee of HMRC. Really good debate, Jill. Thank you very much for getting everybody together. I'm not sure the fact that the room is so full means that we're doing our job very badly or that everybody recognises this is actually a rather important subject, but it's very good that we've got such a good turnout. It was quite interesting going through the speakers, because it wasn't until we got to, I think, Will, that the word politics was mentioned. And I'll just sort of take a couple of quotes from what Paul and Chris said. Paul said, we need bigger barriers to silly changes. Chris said, describe parliamentarians as a bunch of people from the streets. And actually, as I say, Will did refer to tax as a political issue. And Vanessa actually, I thought, used a number of phrases which seemed to me quite important to this debate. She used she referred to politics quite a bit, which was quite reassuring. She also used the words legitimacy and checks and balances. And it seems to me that Chris then subsequently said, would we rather George Osborne or Paul to be setting budgets? Now, I'm not proposing we have a vote in this room on that, but I am suggesting that if you went out to the country as a whole, whatever their political views might be, the public, which Dan Corrie quite rightly invoked as sort of quite relevant in this, might actually think that whether they like George Osborne or not, it was quite important that it should be he who should be setting the tax policy and not an absolutely excellent but singularly unelected representative of the IFS. And I think that in a sense is, I will say something about the criticisms and comments about the process in a second, but I think that is such an important part of this whole debate. Tax is a really important issue. It's an absolutely fascinating issue. I've spent my career in many different aspects of it, and I love it dearly. And it is so interesting because it does involve the extraction of cash, legally and properly owned property from one section of the community for payment to others, and we entrust the decisions on that to some flawed human beings who sit not far from here. And it is pretty impressive that actually we do it, and we haven't had a war on this subject, at least in this country, for over, when did we last have a war on tax?
Except for the poll tax.
Well, which is a case study which illustrates quite a lot of the points. So there's a good thought experiment. If we were all locked in this room and we told that Jill was the only person who had all our wealth, and we then couldn't leave the room until we'd found an orderly and agreed method of distributing it amongst ourselves, how long would it take us? And it is quite impressive that amongst 65 million people, or however many there are in this country, we actually do this annually without huge riots and war. And that's really just a comment that democracy, the checks and balances, the legitimacy and the importance of this actually is really what really matters. What we do at the Treasury and HMRC, which we do very imperfectly, which we acknowledge is the adjunct to that political process. So on to the substance of the comments, and I thought there was a very good diagnosis of a lot of the issues and a lot of the comments which particularly Will made, which are probably only of interest to me, my colleagues in Treasury and HMRC, and a few of you wonks. But there's some really good points of the challenges we have about our resources, about policy skills, about the focus of the department, criticisms of reorganisation and the O'Donnell review, all of which I hope we understand, all of which we struggle with, all of which I hope things are getting better. And given that I have to take a fair degree of responsibility for how the policy partnership has progressed over the last 9 years, I hope they have got a bit better. But on the specific points, on policy expertise, it is a real challenge, and I think the gentleman from the GAD saying, that the government was all about delivery and not policy, and I'm not commenting on whether that's right or not, but actually those of us who work in policy have to struggle with that. We have to create real value for those who work in policy. We have to make careers for them, and how we do that is a real challenge. I think a lot of the comments about the evaluation, the post-implementation evaluation of policies are absolutely right. We have done a fair bit. We could do more. There clearly is just a resource pressure on that because ministers, governments naturally are trying to raise the next pound, not so concerned about how well they raised the last pound. But we have done a lot more in recent years than we have done previously. I think the sort of encouragement and involvement in that from the IFS and others is extraordinarily valuable, and we should keep on doing that. I have to say to the press that when we do put these things out, there's less comment on them because the press love the fun, which Vanessa so entertainingly described, of things going wrong, more than they like going over some sort of quite dry but rather useful analysis that we do. On access to data, absolutely. A word which I don't think anybody's used all evening is transparency, although Will has sort of nodded to it in the way we've been doing our policy making. Transparency is a genuinely important and good thing in a democracy. It's not cost-free, just in terms of resource and effort. We've done a lot more. We have something called the Data Lab, which again, if you're a wonk, I hope you know about. It's a really good system whereby we are making available anonymised taxpayer data to accredited research organisations to allow them to do work. We've just launched the Tax Administration Research Centre, which is a HMRC, ESC, and I think IFS triple venture with the University of Exeter, which is using our data to do joint work on tax administration, which has all sorts of advantages. It pools money in difficult times, it pools expertise, and it makes sure that the academics have real access to real policy making and the decisions. So, and I think that that's a path we should go further on. So we are doing a lot more, but sort of just, I'm sorry, I've taken up rather of your time, Jill. There were a lot of other phrases and terms which were used in the questions, and, you know, fiscal neutrality, you know, I think, you know, there's a debate to be had here or in the IFS on that. The gentleman at the back who raised the question of incidence, as I always say about tax raising, there is no one here but us chickens. You know, it's all very well saying, you know, we want to tax the multinationals. Well, you know, they're owned by shareholders who are pension funds or, you know, individuals. Ultimately, it's all about incidence. It's all about who actually pays the burden, how we share out the money in the room between the people who are here and with future generations. And having a bit more of a debate and a public understanding on incidence is really, really important. I'd like to hear the answer to Julian's question about what do you think the quick wins are, because I quite like to go back to my teams and tell them what you think we should do. And I wouldn't lose sight of the fact there are always multiple objectives in this messy and difficult game. What I'd leave you with, and I'm not going to try and recite them, is, you know, I would go back and read The Wealth of Nations. I would pick up what Adam Smith says about raising tax, because actually his principles of tax and what makes a good tax are extraordinarily enduring, and I think he would recognise an awful lot of the debate if you're here tonight. But thank you for the chance to comment.
No, Edward, that was brilliant. I debated whether I could ask Edward to be on the panel, but we sort of thought that actually it would be too difficult for him to be too public and appear on one of our panels. So it's actually brilliant that you've decided to contribute like that. We're actually nearing the end, so I'm going to ask the panel to think about their sort of closing things. And in that, to pick up John Whiting's point about, you know, should there be wholesale simplification? I think the point about the incidents actually goes to a bit about this public understanding point. I mean, what can we do? So if we are really doing things in the public's name, do the public at least have to have a bit of a better grasp of what's going on, and how might we actually have a better public debate about tax policy? I'm very pleased if anyone wants to respond to any of Edward's specific points. But I remember when I was doing tax policy in the Treasury, it was in the early days when they were giving civil servants objectives, and we didn't really have objectives before then. And the Treasury senior management wanted to give the tax policy team, that was then called Fiscal Policy, in the 6 people that I had doing it, they wanted to give us an objective of delivering a more neutral tax system. And my boss and I pushed back and said, this was clearly not ministers' revealed preference. We would not accept an objective of giving a more neutral tax system when ministers clearly did not want a more neutral tax system. So we ended up to give them the tax system ministers wanted, which, if we believe Dan, is absolutely perfectly mapped onto the tax system the public wants. So that was all very good, wasn't it? But I think one of the really interesting things, having heard Will and others talk about the progress on corporate tax, is one of the problems, and maybe this goes to Julian's fiscal neutrality party, or at least interest of taxpayers party, is part of the problem that there is no counterpart for sort of personal tax and the sort of taxes that hit the generality of the population, as opposed to business or whatever, who is there making the case for actually saying, why on earth are you putting down income tax rates and shoving up employer and employee nicks when actually that's hitting the lower paid more, etc., etc. So it's actually part of the reason we have a debate, and we don't have debates about is it actually sensible. My personal bugbear to have 0 rate VAT on children's clothes, subsidising rich kids in Oshkoshes, when we could actually just raise 1.2 billion and, you know, spend it if we wanted to on the pupil premium or something like that, or at least have a debate about whether that's a good use of money. I mean, is it that there's nobody who's interested in that sort of tax policy issue, as opposed to able to engage on the better structure for controlled foreign companies and things that certainly beyond my comprehension when I did tax policy. So why don't we go down the line? I'll start with Will, just to pick up any of those points you want to comment on.
Okay, well, very quickly, John's idea on wholesale change. I mean, in one sense, yes, that's a great idea. But to go back to Edward's point, I mean, then that becomes deeply political. And that's something which is very hard to hand over to you know, an unelected body to do that. So I think you need to chop it up smaller before you can set the technicians on it. In terms of incidents, look, I completely agree about that. I mean, one of the things that I say to my fellow business people is, look, we're not telling our story very well. We're really not telling our story at all, in fact. And you may not like parts of the story, but at the same time, there's a story to be told about how much tax we pay, about the whole broad range of taxes, not just the corporate income tax. And we need to do that. And the CBI has started to do that. But I think we do need to talk more about this. And, there's plenty of economics out there which shows that the incidence of corporate tax actually falls these days mostly on workers. That's different than it used to be when capital was sort of boundaried within countries. But now that capital is free, a lot of it falls on workers. So again, talking about the incidence I think is quite important. Quick wins, you asked about those. The impractical quick win would be more people, but that's not going to happen. I think the more practical, achievable quick wins are changing the drafting process and this point on career structure and making policy, something which is worth doing again. Also to that gentleman's point. And then this thing on personal taxes, I completely agree. I mean, there are some groups, I'm sure the Taxpayers Alliance would tell you that actually they get in there on personal taxes as well. But there is not, I think part of the problem is that there isn't the same political interest in trying to get tax policy right on that. So there's a sort of demand and supply issue here. I think you need to get that more.
Vanessa?
As a journalist, I'd say roll on simplification, dramatic simplification. I'm really looking forward to that. I think what happened after the 10p rate was abolished by Gordon Brown showed how difficult it is to compensate particular groups. And I think we would expect to see quite a lot of those things. So the gain from, say, merging national insurance and income tax will be real, but there will also be a lot of winners and losers. And I think it's difficult to do this at a time when you're not making big change. I imagine if you had a lot of money to give away, you could do some really good stuff, and you wouldn't get the outcry because overall probably everybody would be either better off or no worse off. But I think when you have to balance things, I think doing any of this is very difficult. But yes, greatly to be desired. And
quick win for Ed, who's taking notes.
Well, I think the MPs play an enormous important part, and so actually getting more resources to help them do their job would be great.
Chris?
Yeah. On the simplification question, I think for those of you who are really interested, if you go to I think it's the February 2011 minutes of the Office of Tax Simplification, you will find a statement there which clearly indicates the direction and the limitations on the Office of Tax Simplification itself. There's a statement there, I've forgotten the exact wording now, used to be in my mind, but basically it says if you think you can do anything important, well, forget it. So it's kind of required reading for anybody who thinks that the process is likely to be simplified in this mechanism. Edward made lots of good points, as always, and there were words that we hadn't used. We have relatively limited time, so perhaps that's part of the explanation. Clearly, I mean, transparency, legitimacy are absolutely fundamental to all of this, and so getting an open process in which the electorate is involved is ultimately of absolutely fundamental importance. How do you do that? Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I tried to explore a little bit in the Oxford report. There are different ways of doing it. Some governments are more committed to finding out what people think than others are. Some countries have a much more of a tradition of secrecy than others do. Some of them manage to break away from that. I had a meeting actually with the Russian Minister for Open Government just a couple of weeks ago, and it always brings a smile actually. In terms of if you look at the international rankings for the budget process, Russia is now 10th in the league. because of the openness of documentation and such like. There are still issues about getting inputs and consultation and such like, and there are obviously some pretty fundamental issues that go beyond the budget process. But they're actually very committed to this, and so the meeting was actually, it was a kind of one-on-one meeting. It was about how to bring more transparency to the process, how to use crowdsourcing as a way of getting inputs to policy. There are lots of things that other governments think about and look at in this area, and we shouldn't just laugh them off, frankly, because if we're not careful, there'll be a point at which we're actually not in the lead. We're lagging behind some people that we think are much less open than we are. I mean, the importance of taxation in the whole democratic process can't be overestimated. And as you go around countries that are struggling to raise tax revenues, that are struggling to get people into the formal economy, the understanding that there really is a link between being part of something and paying your way, and therefore having a real opportunity to hold people to account. I mean, none of that can really be overestimated. And it's clearly important here as well. And although there are some good steps forward that have been taken, it's not perfect yet. And the engagement with the individual citizen here is hampered by lack of information. It's hampered by the education system. It's hampered by other bits of the media than Vanessa's, which prefer banner headlines to any kind of explanation of what's going on. And so we need people who will represent other people in the debate on taxation. And you'd kind of hope that there were 600 odd of those in Parliament who might engage on our behalf, but part of that process is a bit flawed at the moment. So who are you left with? You're left with the NGOs, some of whom are quite good at engaging on these kind of issues. And another two words that haven't been spoken here, and when I did the work with Oxford, they were very rarely spoken in other countries as well, and that's trade unions. There are areas of taxation where in principle trade unions are expert, but in almost every country they're excluded from the process. And whereas business has a voice, trade unions tend not to. And that's something to be thought about, because many countries have had kind of tripartite systems of developing taxation policy which have involved the unions, business and government. Sometimes the result has been unfortunate. In Ireland, for instance, it's almost certainly responsible for kind of the hollowing out of the tax base, which interestingly came about as a result of the ratcheting up of personal allowances. It took loads of people out of paying taxes, and then when the crisis came along, there was a really big problem. We should perhaps think about that as a lesson in the UK. But there is a good reason for involving representatives of the people, whatever they are, particularly in the areas where business isn't necessarily the best voice. We have to use those more effectively, I think. There are some barriers to that because sometimes they rely on people who don't necessarily engage on as professional a level as some of us would like. But I think that's something that is quite important if we can keep democracy and taxation properly aligned here.
Okay, and the last word to
Thank you.
Paul.
Yes, I mean, quite a lot of the questions, and Edward started there about politics and legitimacy, and that's clearly absolutely crucial to all of this. And, in a sense, I sort of divide this into three areas. I mean, there are a series of things that, if you had a technocrat in charge, you might do, but I can completely understand why politically you don't. So, sorting out council tax, for example, I assume we will continue to be charging council tax on 1991 values in 2091. But
a very good proposal.
I understand that. I mean, I think it's kind of sad, but that's sad. And and the flip side of that, I kind of politically understand why it's legitimate to have this absurd stamp duty system. Even if it is kind of deeply sad from my point of view. So there's that kind of stuff. But then there are other sort of policy mistakes which I don't really think have much to do with politics and legitimacy. What happened to capital gains tax on a number of occasions would be one. I think the sort of 0% corporation tax, the film tax relief, and all of this stuff. I mean, again, I understand the politics, but I don't think there's anything like such a good excuse, as it were. So I think you can kind of put those into where, you know, that there are excuses and those where there are less good excuses. The kind of 10p tax is sort of somewhere in between. I mean, the Shadow Chief Secretary almost admitted on television last week that she kind of knew that the 10p tax wasn't great policy, but it was very popular. And actually, they've got a very famous, conversation that occurred before the 1997 election, where a senior sort of Labour Party advisor effectively said, "Well, look, you know, when challenged, but this isn't the best thing you can do for poor people." The answer was, "Yes, it is, because it will help us get elected." It's it's kind of one understands that, even if one is sad about it. Two other kind of things I just want to say. One is about this kind of issue of delivery and policy and the sort of people shifting jobs too often. I think there is a kind of an issue there, but I think people often kind of confuse delivery and policy. I mean, one of the when I was in a government department, not the Treasury, one of the kind of a series of high-profile things had gone wrong, and this was a kind of period when the last government was really focusing on delivery, and the lesson that was taken from this by the permanent secretary was, this was something that had gone wrong with delivery, but actually it hadn't. What was wrong? It was bad policy, which you really couldn't deliver. And I think that's kind of actually describes a lot of where things go wrong in quotes delivery in tax. I'm referring to another area here, but I think there is a kind of there is a misapprehension about delivery and policy. It's very hard to deliver policy, which creates incentives for people to sort of behave badly. And I think this whole issue around legitimacy is crucial there. The last thing, because I'm a nerd, the last thing I'm going to talk about is data. And this is something where I want to give a very big pat on the back to HMRC, because I think 5 years ago HMRC was absolutely at the back of the pack in Whitehall in terms of data availability and research and so on. It was much the worst in Whitehall. Since then, the rest of Whitehall's got much worse, and HMRC has got much better. I think that's fantastic. I think it's a kind of I think it's a serious issue for the rest of Whitehall. The gap between the rhetoric and reality is enormous, and I think there's still a long way to go in HMRC terms. And I see this kind of as interacting a lot with academics. A lot of the best academics in this country just do not work on British stuff, because British data is so bad, and they work on often Scandinavian stuff. Now, I do think HMRC has made huge strides in the last couple of years, and I'm really pleased about that.
Okay, well, I'm going to give my one quick win to Julian, which is that the National Audit Office should do a review of tax expenditures as value for money, because then a lot of other government departments who wonder how the Treasury can waste money on such a scale with so little challenge would at least be satisfied to know that they were being put under the same sort of pressure that they are on often much better justified programmes. So anyway, so that's my quick win. So I just want to do a brief advertisement for two things. I think quite a lot of you probably haven't been to the Institute for Government before. If you are an Institute for Government regular, could you please fill out our stakeholder survey? And if you haven't got it, just drop your card in at the bottom. If you're not but want to be on our mailing list in the future, could you equally drop your card in at the bottom or fill out a form that we have there. I just want to do, if you're interested in the subject of how economic policy is made, so your interest goes beyond tax policy, I'm not sure, Edward's already going there, not interested. Can I just commend a piece of work that was published last month by the LSE Growth Commission in cooperation with the Institute for Government, and has some quite interesting, quite relevant proposals on what they call, I think, the right framework for economic policy making.
Mostly about taking politicians out. What? It's mostly about taking politicians out.
I didn't want to say that. Anyway. It's not just on tax, no. Julian will tell you why that's not what it says when you. But we very much invite you to join us for drinks outside. And just before we do that, can we thank our fantastic panel?